Should it be one of these expensive things that's like 3220, or can you get away with something cheap that's say 2410 of protein to fat? Because it is cheap, and you know what people have argued is we're going to add meat to it, we're adding protein and fat, so why should we pay for the protein and fat in the dry food? Well, you start off thinking about protein and fat, and you end up thinking about feces and water. And the way we get around to doing that is looking at energy. Bioenergetics is the study of energy in the animal, and it's a field that people loathe. Ask Dr. Reynolds what his colleagues think about bioenergetics at Cornell, or ask about Rob Downey, and you'll find out that they'd rather not think about it. But it's really the currency. If you track where the energy from a food goes, you can track what's happening the way if you track where money goes. You can find where other goods come in and out. And it ends up that the feeds very much affect heat production and thermoregulation. And that, you might think that's important in the cold, but it is, because the dog's got a very limited way of controlling its heat in its body, and that's with its breathing. And there's water loss through panting, and from the surface of the tongue and the nasal turbinates and the lungs, there's tremendous water loss. It also ends up that the digestibility of the food, which depends a lot on what you probably call fiber and what I'd like to call fermentable carbohydrate. It affects not only the amount of feces they produce, but the amount of what I call bowel balance, which is the material carried around in the large intestine that the feces comes out of. And that tends to be really quite substantial. You're talking about differences of 1 or 2 kilograms or 2.5 to 4 pounds of body weight. It is just like sort of having a saddle with lead on the back of the animal. So that turns out to be something which could really affect performance. And then when it comes to the fecal output, the differences are so big, and the feces is about 2/3 water. That greatly affects the amount of water the dog is losing. And how many of you have thought in terms of feces of water loss? But it can be substantial, which is what I'm going to try to show you. So I'm going to dehydrate the dogs by getting to poop, and then Ali will come along and tell you how to rehydrate them. What we're talking about in a working dog is conversion of potential chemical energy, glucose, fatty acids, and so on, to mechanical work. And the efficiency of that is anything from about 20 to 40%. What most people have thought about all the time is the rate or the amount of power that can be generated. And you can get more work by degrading glucose than by degrading fatty acids, which is why it sort of tends to be used when an animal's going faster. That's what people have been most concerned with. I've been more, and also there's been some interest in duration. You can run longer on fatty acids because you've got big fat depots than you can on glucose because you've got a limited amount of glycogen reserves. I've been interested in efficiency because what happens if you take chemical energy and you get work, the difference is heat. And heat regulation is very important, and as many of you know, I've been working with horses for the last 8 years. There's tremendous interest in horses and how they get rid of heat, especially with Atlanta coming up, because the Humane Society of the US wanted to cancel the horse events at the Olympics because of this heat that comes from metabolism. The other thing that gets generated from metabolism is acid, and actually I've been working mainly on acid base for the last 5 years and acid production, but looking at these sort of byproducts that you get instead of work, you can look then at where some of these go, and this gets down to loss of water and effects on body weight and fecal production, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about. Now, just to give you an idea, a lot of this gets done with numbers, and that's what drives students up the wall, and I'm not going to use numbers, I'm just going to use bar graphs. And you can just look at the area of these bar graphs and how high or how long they are and get an idea, an appreciation for what's going on. Now, this is one that relates to power. Power in terms of ATP generation. You can see on your bottom left, FAs for fatty acids, very slow generation of work per unit time, or very little power. Oxidizing glucose, about twice as much. Breaking down muscle glycogen, about twice that. and from phosphocreatine, and I talked briefly about creatine yesterday, about twice that. And this is what people have been looking at when they're thinking in terms of how we should fuel humans and animals to run faster. They've been very much wrapped up in this relationship. I've been more interested in this kind of thing. If we take fiber or starch or fat and oxidize them directly, which is the bottom half of this figure, now I'm plotting efficiency along the bottom, and I've got labels for the kinds of food constituents on the upside. And you'll see that the top ones for acetate and glucose, if they're first converted into body fat, and this will happen within an hour or 2 hours after a meal. So if you've fed your animal 4 hours before it races, then what you're dealing with is these materials like acetate that's come from fermentation of fiber, or glucose that's come from starch, that's gone into fat and come out, and at about half the efficiency of the work you can get. It's extremely inefficient, whereas if you take fatty acids and look at the third bar down, it's almost as long as the bottom one. If you take a fatty acid from the food and stick it into body fat, there's hardly any loss in efficiency. So if you feed fat and then it goes into fat tissue and it gets oxidized, there's hardly any penalty. But if you feed carbohydrates, starch, cereal grains, or if you feed fiber, there's a tremendous cost in the loss of efficiency. Now that's kind of an introduction to the hard part. This is partitioning the energy, and I have to point to a few. Why don't you change it when I yell at you?
Okay.
You know how to do it? Press the top button.
Okay.
These are color-coded. This stuff that's brown is feces. Never guess. And fiber gives you a lot more. The white band is gas. This gets produced when the fiber is fermented. And you'll see that it's only there for fiber. There's no white band anywhere else. The yellow band is for loss of energy in the urine. My secretary told me to bring her back some snow, and I promised her some yellow snow. So the red stuff is heat. Enormous amounts of energy lost is heat. And you'd think here there's more energy lost from fat and more energy lost from protein, and they are. They're heating things. The so-called thermogenic effects of fat and protein are really large. And the work is the green band, and you'll see it's very small. Next, please. If I express those for each one of them, the energy is fractions of 100%. You can see that you're getting really, even from the gross energy, very little from fiber, very little from protein. A lot more of the energy that's in fat will end up in work than in carbohydrate or fiber or starch or fiber or protein. Next, please. And if I look in terms of what will generate 1 megacalorie, and that's about 2/3. Your dogs at rest are about 1.5 megacalories. In training, they probably go up to 4. They probably subside to sort of 2.5 to 3 during the racing season for middle distance, and in the Iditarod, they go up to 10 a day. But here's just 1 megacalorie. You can see that to generate 1 megacalorie from these different sources, you need very little fat. This is 301. You need 1,200, 4 times as much of starch or protein, and you need nearly 10 times as much of fiber. And I'm using fiber here because that's probably what you're used to. If you look at the fiber that's on the labels, it's crude fiber. Now actually crude fiber is just the lignin and about 3/4 of the cellulose in food. The total fiber is probably double that. And then the stuff that's usually called starch and figured out as starch the way that you calculate it in the dog food industry, probably 1/5 of that is oligosaccharides and resistant starch that resists hydrolysis. So I end up sort of getting for fiber over twice as much, 2.5 times as much as the fiber that's on the label. It gets to be quite an appreciable amount of that dry dog food that you feed. And that's probably what's limiting the amount of dry dog food that you can feed. And all of you have found you can only get like 3/4 to a pound. With the very best, you can go a bit more. That's probably the limitation. Next, please. And then, how much feces gets produced from all this? I've got the fecal dry matter in green, and I double it the amount for water, because feces is about 2/3 water. You can see that you're getting substantial water losses here when you feed the amount of food or these food ingredients to get 1 megacalorie. And then if I look at the rate at which this stuff goes through the dog, I'm giving a figure of 34, which is hours, which is a pretty representative value for fiber, and 17 hours for these others. You can see the bowel ballast. This is weight in kilograms. You can about double these for weight in pounds. If you gave it a totally fiber diet, you'd have sort of 13 pounds or 6 kilograms of bowel ballast here, and you can see with fat you've got hardly any. So it pays you when you're sort of going for long distance and have to feed huge amounts of feed to feed fat. You can see here in terms of bowel ballast how important it is. Can I have the next one? Well, I've been talking about energy for work. We usually divide up the energy into that for maintenance, and that's your dog just lollygagging around in the summer and work. And I just want to point out here that there's a lot more net energy for maintenance. In fact, for work, the factors are between 0.2 and 0.3, and here they're between 0.7 and 0.8. Because we sort of started late, you could just go quickly through the next couple of slides, just flash it on. This is the same thing for maintenance work. You see a lot more energy here for fat in the next one. This again for 1 megacalorie. You can see for maintenance the difference is not so big, but still it's nearly 3 times, it's about 7 times more for fiber than it is for fat, and fat's only 1/3 of that for starch and protein. So even at maintenance there's some advantage for fat, but nowhere near as much as for when you're using work. So where fat really becomes important is in that excess work above the maintenance requirement of the dog. Next, please. And here's the thing showing you, a figure showing you bowel balanced again. Here's the feces. Here's the fecal water required to get rid of fiber. Fecal water required to get rid of fat. Very much less. More water required to get rid of protein than to get rid of starch. A little bit more. And this water loss, as you can see from these numbers, is really substantial. If you are feeding fiber instead of fat, get an enormously greater amount of loss of water. This compared to this in the feces, and of course that's how dogs really get dehydrated. You get diarrhea and you go up by another order of 10. Next, please. Now I'm getting to the feeds instead of the constituents. I took a typical dry dog food and all its ingredients in a typical dense, dry, expensive 3220. I've taken meat as being 20% fat, and if it's 30% fat, if it's 30% fat, there's probably about 20% protein and 50% water in it. So this is a 20 of protein and 30 of fat, and here's straight fat. And you can see here again that from a given amount of straight fat, there's a lot more energy available from fat than there is from the commercial dog foods or from meat. And the next one I'll show you a bit more of this. This is for work. You can see here a lot of heat coming from fat, but fat's got a lot of energy in it. If we express that as a fraction of it, as the next slide shows you, and we're now getting 1 megacalorie of work from each one, you can see that you need relatively less fecal production and heat production from fat than from these other foods, than from meat or the dry dog foods. And next, please. This is for work, the same sort of thing, and you see when we go to work, there's even greater advantages coming for fat than from meat and from the dry dog foods. And the next one, and what these then boil down to is in terms of food intake. And what I've done here is plot in yellow the sort of food intake that you'd need in kilograms per day of these foods for the North American Championship, or a dog doing about 4,000 calories. And then the extras in white, what a dog would need for the Iditarod. And you can see here that if you're going to feed, well, you can't possibly feed enough dry dog food of an ordinary type. There's some real advantages in having one that is more highly digestible, a 3220 type food. You can see the advantage of meat over both of these, but you can see the incredible advantage of fat, the relatively small amount of fat that you have to feed in order to get the energy for especially for the longer race. And the next one, and this gives you the fecal output. And what I've done is plot the dry matter in yellow and the water and the feces in white. Here's the North American, here's the Iditarod dog, and this is a 4,000 calorie dog, and this is a 10,000 calorie dog. You can see the advantage that you get with the 3220, a real advantage coming with meat, and another extreme advantage coming with fat. I think you can see from this that you would want to keep the dry food down to a limit and use the best one that you can, maybe providing about 1,500 to 2,000 calories with the best quality dry food you could get, going up to 4,000 calories with meat, and you really have to go the rest of the way with fat because of this. And I think the next step, which nutritionists like me and my two colleagues on this panel are thinking about, is when you do give just fat, you get these incredible advantages in energy density and in saving water and in having a lighter dog without this ballast in its belly. But they're empty calories, and you go running like that for 10 days, you could start running into problems. And we're all thinking in terms of trying to make some sort of supplement that would be maybe 5% of the weight that we could put in and help the dogs that way. Well, I'm sorry to have bored you with all these numbers, but I can assure you that if I'd have put up tables instead of the bar graphs, you'd have seen even less about it. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
When you're comparing the dry dog food and the meat and the fat, what are you actually comparing? Are you comparing weight or the equivalent calorie output?
No, I've gone back to weights here of the materials. I calculated my way through on calories, but I've converted this back into kilograms per day for this final two figures.
Okay. The meat is in its normal state, the dry dog food, that what they should be soaked at? I mean, whereas
this is
dry and meat obviously
the meat's got 50%. This meat has got 50% water. The easiest way to figure out meat is to figure out how much fat is in it. And if you grind up meat or look at meat and see a lot of it, you'll start to be able to guess how much fat is in it. Very commonly, the sort of meat that you deal with has got about 30% fat in it. And if you take the 30% fat and subtract that, then what's left, about 1/3 is protein and 2/3 is water. In this example, I'm just using a 30% fat because I think this is pretty common that you'd be using. That would have 20% protein and about 50% water. This is how it would end up in the feces, with the dry matter components here in yellow and the water in white. Yeah?
Have you done any studies with fish? I mean, is fish under the meat category?
Yeah, fish is meat as far as I'm concerned. Except fish is very variable in fattiness, and I don't know how fat the fish you have feed are. I understand, for instance, that salmon can vary enormously in the amount of fat that's in it, from about 30 or 40% of the dry matter down to hardly anything when they've been wrung out in their reproductive endeavors.
Does your meat protein fat ratio change if you converted that to a dry matter analysis? I mean,
Well, I did. I converted it and I did all the energy on an energy basis, and that's counting the water as nothing. And I brought it back. I put the water in again to get the amounts. Can you go back a slide?
Reverse.
This one. No, the other one.
No, we're on reverse.
Another one. I've got the water back in these. 10% water, 10% water, 50% water, and no water in these weights. I'm sorry I went through so quick, but when you drop it, go into energy, you're counting nothing for the water. And yet that's ironic, because of all the nutrients, the one you could do least without is water, and it has many functions. And roughly we usually calculate 1 liter of water for every megacalorie of energy that's expended, and it's remarkable how that holds up under a whole variety of conditions. So when you go to high calories, you also go to high water requirements, and water can become limiting. Yeah?
You're talking about fecal ballasting. I guess my question is, if you're feeding a lot of fiber to a dog, it's going to poop fairly regularly. If you feed a lot of fat to a dog, is it going to load up to some point and then defecate, or is it going to do little packages all the time to net down?
Dogs are a bit weird in the way they defecate. The transit time through the stomach and small intestine is very constant, and it's like 3 to 4 or 5 hours. And then the residence time in the large bowel can be brief. It can be as little as an hour with some studies, and right out to 40, 45 hours with others. But the retention time, that's why I counted 34 hours retention time for the fiber and 17 hours retention time for the starch, the protein, and the fat. It could be faster. Actually, if dogs get excited, they can empty themselves out, and that might sort of screw up my bowel ballast thing. But if you've got dogs running all the time, and long-distance dogs especially, their bowel ballast is going to be, of that order of magnitude, pretty close. Because, they'll have got down to reasonably regular habits, but I'm giving you average figures here, and that's not to say that you don't have a dog that empties itself out. That's why I started off by saying you study this in the frozen tundra with it flying in your face. Would you rather have it splatter, or would you rather have it frozen? This is Well, if that's enough questions for me, I'll turn it over to Ali Reynolds, who will now put the water back in the dog for you.
You guys see this, or does it need to be raised up a little? I didn't give it to you.
Yeah, raised up a little bit.
I got a couple books over here to put on. Now we can go down here. Well, while we're checking the screen there, good morning, and what I wanted to talk to you about this morning is water. And it's something that we certainly all do consider when we're feeding our dogs, but I think it's something that we often overlook, or maybe don't quite understand as well as we should. And I wanted to give just a basic review on how dogs get water and what they do with it, and then review some of the things that we've recently done with water, trying to help hydrate dogs during a period of times when hydration might be difficult to maintain. Can everybody hear me in the back? I'm losing my voice, so if you can't hear me, raise your hand. I wanted to start with a picture of Doc Lombard, because for me he was a giant in the sport, and this is a picture of Doc at his kennel in Massachusetts. He was really the first guy that I think addressed hydration issue in dogs. Before a dog came along, most people, I think, just let the dog in the snow in the wintertime. And he watered his dogs, and it made a big difference, and I think that's the reason why a lot of us water our dogs today. I happen to be here in, can you lower that stair? I happened to be here in Alaska when Doc died, and it was really a strange thing because I was in Anchorage, and it was on all of the major news stations. It was the leading story, and it was on the front page of the newspaper. And I lived at that time about 40 miles from where Doc lived, and I called home and talked to my wife, and I said that I heard that Doc Lumber had died, and at home it wasn't in any of the newspapers or on the television or anything. So it's kind of a strange thing, but he sure has left a great legacy. One of the things that I think we really need to keep in mind about water is, you know, we've talked a lot about energy and protein yesterday, we talked about supplements, but water is without a doubt the most important nutrient. It comprises 70% of the animal's body weight. And while you could get along with a slight deficiency of protein for a while, or essential fatty acids, or vitamins, or minerals, and the dog would do quite well for a while, mild deficiencies of water can have a dramatic impact on the animal's health and therefore the performance. So it doesn't take very long for these changes to occur. One of the things that water does, it does so many things that we could spend hours talking about it, but just basically it is the solvent in which everything in the body that is dissolved is dissolved. It's the major transport medium, all the blood cells, all the proteins, all the vitamins and minerals that are transported back and forth to the cells are carried in water. It's also means for shock absorption in the joints. It's what allows us to see. It lubricates all the mucous membranes. And one thing that we probably don't always think about, it's very, very important in thermal regulation. Even in dogs that don't sweat. You dehydrate an animal, you deprive them of their ability to regulate the body temperature. Both from the fact that their circulatory system doesn't work well, but also from the fact that there's sensors in their brain that once we change the concentration of different electrolytes, we disturb that animal's ability to recognize that it's overheating, and therefore it's like a thermostat doesn't work. So maintaining hydration is really, really important for normal thermal regulation. If we look at how water is broken up, this slide here shows you how each compartment it stands as a percent of total body weight, and then as a percent of total body water. The reason I show this is that most of the water that's found inside an animal's body is found inside the individual cells. It makes up 45% of total body weight and 65% of total body water. So almost the largest share of water is inside the cells. Then the rest is in different extracellular components. One being the interstitial space, or the fluid that bathes the cells. One being plasma, or the fluid that's in blood. And then the final one being what we call transcellular. That's just a garbage department for all the other water in the body, like the water that's secreted in the GI tract, the water that's present in the eye, the water that's present in the cerebrospinal fluid, and the water that's present in joint fluid. But the reason I show this is that you can see that plasma, or the water that's present in the bloodstream, makes a pretty small percentage of total body water. You know, it's only 10% of total body water. And when we dehydrate animals, one of the things that we often try to do is pump them full of fluids intravenously. But we can replace their entire plasma volume, and we've only put back 10% of total body water. When animals get dehydrated, they don't just lose water from their plasma. Certainly that's the most important space, because that's what takes care of circulation. We have to maintain that. But oftentimes when an animal is severely dehydrated, they've lost a lot of fluid from inside their cells as well, and that takes much longer to put back. You can see it's a much larger volume, and if we replace all of this, it would just make a small dent in losses that we've made here. So while it's important to maintain plasma volume so we have good circulation, all the organs work, we can't overlook the fact that when an animal is dehydrated, it's more than just a depression in plasma volume. So we've done some research on this at Cornell, and before we get into that, I'd just like to discuss a little bit of water balance with you so we can understand where water goes in animals that are working. One of the problems that we see, or the big problems that we see with dehydration and why it affects performance so much, is number one, it makes the heart have to work harder. There's two reasons for that. If you think of the circulatory system of an animal as a closed system, we've decreased the volume that's present in that system, the pump that's circulating it throughout the whole area. So if you think of it as a water pipes in your house, that pump has to work a lot faster to keep the fluid moving to all the different parts. if we decrease the volume of fluid that's flowing through. If we increase the volume, the pump doesn't have to work as hard. And that's why one of the big adaptations to training is to increase plasma volume. It makes it easier for the heart to work. The other problem with dehydration is that blood is not just a fluid, it's got all those little particles in there that we call blood cells, particularly red blood cells. And when we decrease the plasma volume, it makes those red blood cells more concentrated and the blood becomes more viscous. It's kind of like the oil in your car at 25 below. You know, it's harder to get that pumping up through the engine of your car, in this case through the circulatory system of the dog, because it's thicker and more viscous and sticky. And it doesn't go through those little capillary beds as well. So because of that, we have an impaired delivery of nutrients to the working muscles and impaired removal of waste. So things do not work as well as they normally would. And as I mentioned earlier, the other problem that we have is impaired thermal regulation, both because we're not circulating things as well, so we can't remove that heat, push it out to the periphery, but also because the central nervous system that deals with telling which of these valves should open and close to help cool things off does not sense that there's a problem when an animal is dehydrated. The normal thermostat just doesn't work during dehydration. So how do you monitor it? Well, most of you probably are pretty good at this, but just a quick review. You can look at mucous membrane moisture. You can run your finger inside the mouth of the dog, feel their gums, and see if they're sticky. If the animal is really dehydrated, that's a good thing to do, but sometimes if they're panting or something, they're drying their mucous membranes a little bit, and you may not be able to use that. Capillary refill time. If you lift up the gum or the lip on a dog and look at their gum, press your finger down into it and you make a little white spot, as long as they don't have black gums. You make a little white spot on that, and that white spot should go away within a second or so. If it takes more than 2 seconds to go away, probably that animal's got a problem. And the final thing, the thing we use the most is skin turd. We take a dog and we lift up the skin right over their scapula, over their shoulder blades, and let it go back down. It should, in a normal dog, just snap right back down. If it stays tented up and slowly goes down like that, that animal's dehydrated. And in severe cases, their eyes electrically sink back into their socket. So those are things that you can just look at on a dog and say, yeah, that dog is probably dehydrated or hydration status is okay. I apologize for this side, it's a little bit dark, but the next thing I wanted to bring up in talking about water balance is how a dog gains and loses water. There's several ways that a dog can get water into his body. The most common way for us is probably in his diet. We all water our dogs as well, but we give them a tremendous amount of water in the food as well. Most of us mix water with their food, and a lot of us put meat into the food which has got a lot of water in it. And so diet or water as it is probably the major way for it getting in, but you can't forget that as the dog's working and as it's burning calories, it actually generates water. And it'll generate 10 to 16 mils, and this should be per 100 kcal. So for every 100 calories that are burned up, 10 to 16 mils of water can be generated. And for every gram of glycogen, that glucose storage unit we talked about yesterday, that is consumed, about 3 to 4 mils of water are released. And this metabolic water, the water that's released during metabolism, can account for as much as 10 or 15% of an animal's total body water needs during exercise, even for like an Iditarod dog. So it can be a significant contributor to water gain. Next slide. Now, water loss. We and horses, as Dr. Kronfeld talked about yesterday, sweat quite a bit. But dogs only sweat pretty much on the pads of their feet. And it's thought that might be an evolutionary adaptation for gripping smooth surfaces like ice and rock in the pursuit of prey. But it's not a significant water loss in the dog. Respiration can be a very significant water loss, as can salivation, and they can work together in warm temperatures. We've all seen dogs, and we particularly have a problem with it in the lower 48. When they're exercising in warm conditions, they really froth up at the mouth, and they're salivating and are also breathing very, very rapidly. And that's because dogs' cooling mechanism is a lot different than ours. Because dogs have a fairly large surface area and a fairly small volume, they can't afford to sweat. If they sweat, they would dehydrate very, very rapidly. We and horses and most other larger animals have a pretty big volume and a relatively small surface area, so it's safe for us to sweat. We're not going to dehydrate doing that. So the dog's adaptation to keeping itself cool is to pant. And what that does is it helps cool the blood that's going to the brain so the brain doesn't overheat. But that's often at the expense of keeping the body temperature high. So respiration and panting is the main way of cooling in dogs. And to give you an idea, I've done some calculations and I'll show you a slide on this in just a minute. But respiratory water losses can be tremendous in a dog that's exercising in either very warm or in very cold conditions. In very cold conditions, like you guys have here today, what happens is the dog inhales water that's about 0% humidity. And in its lungs, that air is brought up to about 100% humidity, and then it's exhaled at 100% humidity. So it's losing a fair amount of water every time it breathes. And for those of you who are used to exercising dogs in cold weather, you know you've got the dog exhaust as you're going down the trail. You can see it, that cloud that's coming off the dog. And if the dogs are exercising for a long period of time, and in this type of climate, even if they're just sitting around, they're losing water every time they breathe. So the more breaths they take when they're exercising, the more rapid their rate of water loss is. Water loss to urine can also be very significant in dogs that are exercising because they take in so much more energy. Dr. Kronfeld was showing today that a lot of the things that are in that food, like the waste products of protein metabolism and the salts and electrolytes that they eat, most of that stuff has to be excreted through the urine, the extra that's not being used in all of the waste products. And so there's a minimum amount of urine that has to be produced for all of these wastes to get them out of the body, and that amount of urine increases dramatically as caloric intake increases. So dogs, for those of you who run distance dogs, you know they tend to urinate a lot, and part of that is because they're eating lots of calories. And then also, as Dr. Kronfeld talked about this morning, feces have to be considered. And as you mentioned, fiber intake makes a big difference in the amount of water that's lost in feces. But in most of the rations we feed, they're fairly low in fiber, so the water loss through feces is usually a fairly small proportion of the total amount of water that's lost each day, unless, as Dr. Kronfeld mentioned, that the dogs have diarrhea, and then you can go to a whole order of magnitude or get a 10 times increase in fecal water loss. In that case, it becomes one of the most significant places of water loss, and it's one of the things I want to address with our hydration strategy here today. One of the places where you can apply what we're going to talk about probably to the greatest degree would be dogs that have diarrhea and bringing them back from that type of dehydration. Now this slide shows amount and sources of daily water loss associated with exercise environments for 3 different types of dogs. And I just want to go through this quickly for you. The orange here would be, should have made it yellow like Dr. Kronfeld did, but the orange is urinary water loss. The dark blue is fecal water loss, and the light blue is respiratory water loss. And this would be, these are all for 20 kilogram or about 44 pound sled dogs. This would be for a sled dog that, say, is retired and living in your house now. You can see that most of the water loss comes through urine. There's a little bit with feces and a very little bit with respiratory water loss. And if you had a humidifier in your house, maybe this would be a little bit lower. Now, if we take that same dog and make him an open class or North American sprint dog and put him outside in Alaska this time of year and this type of temperature, his caloric increase in caloric intake about doubles. And so his urinary water loss increases pretty significantly, but you can see now respiratory water loss has become a very significant contributor to total water loss. And then if we turn that same 44-pound dog into a distance or a Iditarod type dog that's out exercising maybe 10 or 12 hours a day during the race, now we've again doubled his caloric intake roughly from what a sprint dog was. And so there's an obligatory amount of extra urine he has to excrete to get rid of the extra waste associated with that food. His fecal output has increased, but it's still not a huge contributor. But now look at how important respiratory water loss is. And that's because that dog is breathing more rapidly than it normally would for 10 hours a day in an environment where each time it breathes, water is leaving its body. So this respiratory water loss is a pretty important component in dogs exercising in cold environments. Next slide, please. It also is important, this is a slide from home in Ithaca, New York, and this is actually not, except for the trees were turned before we left, this is very similar to the types of temperatures we've been running in lately. My last training run before I came up here was 58 degrees. And these guys have pretty high respiratory water losses too, but that's because they're salivating at the same time as they're panting and trying to cool themselves off. Dog saliva is pretty interesting, and Dr. Kronfeld made this point yesterday. When dogs lose water during exercise, most of what they lose is just that water. You and I go out, if we were going to run in real warm temperatures like this and sweat a lot, we'd also lose some salt, some sodium, some chloride, a little bit of potassium. And horses lose even more because their sweat's really concentrated in these electrolytes. But dogs don't lose significant amounts of electrolytes when they lose water unless they have diarrhea or they're exercising in really warm environments for long periods of time. Because when dogs salivate for long periods of time, initially that saliva is almost pure water. And as they keep panting for many minutes, say an hour or two, the saliva actually becomes more concentrated and actually becomes a significant loss of sodium and bicarbonate in that saliva. So the longer that a dog salivates in warm weather, the more electrolytes it does lose, and there may be a good reason for electrolyte supplementation to dogs in really warm environments. We talked about cold dogs, so we'll move on. Now, there are lots of different strategies for getting water into dogs. And as I mentioned before, a lot of us mix water in with our feeds and feed feeds that are high in meat, and so that can be one of the most significant sources of water for the dog. But a lot of us use baited water as well, and if we're not feeding meat, at least soak dry foods or feed fish. And someone asked Dr. Kronfeld about fish. We've done a little bit of analysis on fish. Particularly out in the Midwest, a lot of people use lake trout and whitefish to supplement dogs during distance races. And most of the fish that we've analyzed have been up around 80 to 85% water. So they're almost like giving the dog a little ice cube with some protein in it as well. So they can be a real good source of water. A lot of folks like to make frozen treats for their dogs too, because for some reason, I think it's maybe because the dogs are warm when they're exercising, but a lot of dogs would rather eat something frozen and chew on that than if you give them the same thing thawed out as a treat during a race. Tim White's famous for doing this. So we can give baited water, we can put water in with the food. Several people have tried using electrolytes. We talked a little bit about that yesterday. My experience with electrolytes in dogs are that if you're going to use them, you should dilute them to about twice what the package recommendation is if you're using a powder. Because if you don't, what I've noticed is dogs end up dipping an awful lot. I think electrolytes, if they're given in too strong a dose, can actually make the dogs a little bit thirsty. But after races like the Rendezvous and the North American, particularly the North American when in the warmer weather, a lot of folks will with the evening meal, float the food in a small amount of electrolyte solution in an attempt to get a little bit more electrolytes into the dogs, and I think that's a good thing to do. Ken Hinchcliffe has done some work on Rick Swenson's dogs, both during races and during 4 or 5 days of continuous training, and shown that when you work continually or very hard for 2 or 3 or 4 days in a row, sodium concentrations in the blood tend to drop. And so we're not sure exactly where that's going, but it seems like maybe the food, particularly if they're just getting a straight dry food, and even more so if they're getting dry food mixed with meat because meat is low in sodium, we may need to supplement that a little bit with electrolytes. And finally, there's been a lot of work done recently in the human side of things, and we've done some work in the last 1.5 years with dogs looking at using glycerol as a hydrating agent. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the talk talking about. Glycerol is a very simple compound. It's a 3-carbon alcohol. It's pretty small. It's a normal component of fat. When we look at, say, beef fat or beaver fat, if you want to look at the chemical structure of that, what it is it's 3 long fatty acids, which are the big part of the energy of that molecule, held together with a little glycerol backbone. It's a sweet, sticky, clear, odorless fluid. It's very, very viscous. Dogs like it because it's sweet. Next slide. What's neat about it is because it's such a teeny little molecule, it can basically cross every membrane in the dog's body at will. Whereas the larger a molecule gets, the more selective things are. And it's also, because it's an alcohol, it's soluble or can dissolve both in water solutions and in fat solutions, so it easily goes through cell membranes. The other nifty thing about it is it likes to drag water with it wherever it goes. So that if you give an animal glycerol, what happens is that glycerol basically moves across every membrane in the animal's body, pulling water with it, and therefore increases the amount of water in basically all the cells of that animal's body. Next slide. In people, what they've done now is put some glycerol in sports drinks, particularly for athletes that are exercising in really hot, really humid environments. And the studies where this has been done in Northern Arizona University, they've taken glycerol solutions and given them to athletes and then had them ride a bicycle on a treadmill in a chamber that's 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 90% humidity, until they are exhausted. sounds like a lot of fun. I bet it really smells bad too. But what they found is if they give them some glycerol, each group gets the same amount of water. But if they give them glycerol in the water, those guys that get the glycerol, they don't produce as much urine. In other words, they're holding on to that water. And what that does during exercise is it gives them more water to sweat with. And so they get a decreased core body temperature during exercise, and they're able to exercise longer in these hot, humid environments, basically because they don't cook as fast. Allows them to hold on to more water. And you can actually measure it. They actually gain a little bit of body weight, and they've actually measured sweat off these guys, and they are able to produce more sweat. Next slide. So what we did is we took 8 of our dogs that were housed outside in fairly warm weather. 25 degrees C would be about, I think, 78 or 80 degrees, and 60% humidity. So this was Ithaca in the summertime. And we measured their total body water. We measured the amount of extracellular fluid. Remember, that's the smaller of the two components. Most of the fluid's in the cells. But we measured total body water and extracellular fluid so we could subtract extracellular from total body water to get intracellular and figure out where all this fluid was going. We also measured their packed cell volume, or hematocrit, their total protein, and creatine kinase levels. Next slide, please. And the nice thing about sled dogs is they usually are pretty willing as far as the eating and drinking part of things. So it's not these are pretty easy studies to do. Next slide. And this is what we found. The orange bars are what we measured before we administered either water alone or water plus 1 gram per kilogram body weight glycerol. And in each case we gave the dogs 1 liter of water. So the orange bar is before and the blue bar is 3 hours afterwards. And what you can see is basically there was no change in packed cell volume in either group. It looks like there's a trend for a change here. It's not significant. Next slide, please. There was also no change in total protein. So in neither case did we really expand plasma volume or dehydrate them. It doesn't seem like we changed anything at all in the plasma side of these dogs, in their blood. Next slide, please. And then we measured total body water, and the way we do this is we inject the dogs with heavy water. And we allow that heavy water to equilibrate throughout the dog's entire body. And then 3 hours later, we take another blood sample and measure the concentration of heavy water in that blood sample. And by knowing how much we originally injected and knowing what the concentration is in the blood sample, we can then calculate the volume that original injection has distributed itself into. And in doing so, what we found is that there is no difference in extracellular fluid. I'm sorry, this is the extracellular fluid. Can you flip one? Wait, no, leave it right here for a second. That was total body water that I just told you about, how we measured that. This is extracellular fluid. And the way that we measured this was using a compound called sodium thiocyanate. You inject that into the dog's plasma. That can't cross cell membrane, so it distributes through everything in the body except the cells. And again, we then bleed the dogs every half hour, and we can make a curve then that will take us down to 0, and anyways back calculate out and figure out what volume this sodium thiocyanate can distribute itself into and get a measure of the fluid outside the cells, how much fluid there is outside the cells in the whole body. And what we found is that there was no difference between the two treatment groups in extracellular fluid. So we haven't changed anything in the blood, and we haven't changed anything in the fluid that's bathing the cells or in other places in the body. And we assumed, originally anyways, that if this glycerol worked, it was going to work by cooling fluid into the cells and holding it there. So we wanted to see what effect it would have on those. Next slide, please. So when we measured total body water, as I told you before, and then we measured extracellular fluid, we subtracted extracellular fluid from total body water to get the change in intracellular fluid. This slide is labeled wrong. This is change in intracellular fluid. And what we found is that the dogs that were given water, 3 hours after they were given water, had about a 5% increase in intracellular fluid. The dogs that were given water plus glycerol had about a 10.5% increase in intracellular fluid. So in other words, between a 4 and 5% greater increase in intracellular fluid when they're given glycerol versus when they're given water alone. And we followed this out. I don't have the slides for this because we just did this study, but we followed this out to 24 hours, and it seems like this effect stays like this for out to 24 or 36 hours. So after 1 dose of glycerol, they maintain more fluid in their cells than if we just gave them water alone. I think the reason for this increase in intracellular fluid after giving the dogs water is that in order to make sure the dogs were all in the same state of hydration. We removed water from them the night before this experiment took place, and they're only allowed to drink after we did everything in the morning. So they've been withheld from water for probably 16 hours. So they're probably mildly dehydrated to begin with. So this is probably the reason why they're giving them some water brought their intracellular fluid up a little bit. And the glycerol, though, seems to be able to hold more water in their cells than just water alone. And although dogs don't sweat, I think this could still be an advantage if you're going into a period in a race or a training session where it's going to be hard to get water into the dogs. You can actually water load them a little bit using this type of technique. And even more importantly, I think this would be useful in rehydrating dogs that have suffered from diarrhea, because even on intravenous fluids, you can't increase the amount of fluid in their cells as rapidly as you can by using this type of technique. Now, having said that, it's not without risk. And I'm not recommending that folks go try this just yet. These are some preliminary experiments that we've done. We know that if you take, for instance, rats, forgive me, Dominique, and you use this in them, if you overdo the glycerol side of things with rats, you can actually cause their cells to swell so much that you injure them. Okay, and we measured creatine kinase on these dogs, which is a measurement of cell injury in dogs, and we got no increase with this amount of glycerol. So at this level, it appears to be quite safe. But I'm not sure where the upper limit is, because we're just beginning this, and therefore I'm not recommending that everybody try this, but we have tried it in a couple clinical cases that were dehydrated, and it seems to help them recover a little bit quicker from dehydration. So if you keep it at 1 gram per kilogram of body weight as a single dose, it seems to be quite safe and quite effective as well. Next slide, please. So, possible applications for this, as I mentioned, were prevention of dehydration. For instance, if you were going to run the Open North American and you got up in the morning and the weatherman said it was going to be 60 degrees that day for the 30-mile heat, this might be something that would help dogs. If they're going to go out slower in the beginning because they're actually going to weigh more and they're going to feel a little bit sluggish. But when you get to about mile 20, they may be able to keep themselves a little bit cooler and feel a little bit better using this type of system. And again, I think the larger application for it is treatment of dehydration and oral rehydration. I think it has some real broad applications here, as much as things like maybe even parvo puppies, but certainly our dogs that get these undescribed either bacterial or viral diarrheas on the trail. You could probably, especially if you've got a few hours to rest them, I think you could really help bring their hydration status up. Next slide, please. Of course, the risks, as I mentioned, if you overdose, you can cause cell swelling and injury. And if you use too concentrated a solution of this, the human athletes who have tried it said they get pretty nasty intestinal bloating and cramping. At the dose that we used, even when we gave the dogs a whole liter of water, which is a lot in one bolus, we didn't have any problems with vomiting or diarrhea. But it's one of these things, just as I mentioned yesterday, you'd never want to try this for the first time in a race. If you're going to use it, you should definitely try it in training and see how your dogs react. Next slide, please. I think the applications, as we mentioned earlier, are places where there's lots of water loss, like warm weather or cold weather exercise, and animals with dehydration. Next slide, please. And we also are going to be trying this stuff out on field trial hunting dogs probably next October. And it may have some application for even some of the dogs like Dominique's working with, the search and rescue type guys, because at high altitude dehydration can be a real problem. Next slide, please. I'd like to thank the IAMS company because they supported this research. Next slide, please. And of course, thank the dogs because they did all the work. If you guys have any questions, I'd be glad to give those right now. Yes?
So when you're given the 1 gram per kilogram body weight, you're giving it with a liter of water?
Yeah, you could go as probably as low as 500 mils on that. I wouldn't go any lower. Yeah. And I would also check out your dogs because at that level you might have dogs that have problems with getting cramps. Yeah.
Can you just buy glycerol?
Well, you can buy it in sport. They make human sports drinks now that have it. I can get it because it's a laboratory chemical, that you use for lots of reagents. But a lot of the laboratory companies are hesitant now to sell it to people because they're afraid of liability if people take it themselves. But it's really cheap. I mean, you can buy a gallon of this stuff for about $20, and a gallon would do a lot of dogs for a long time. No, you can't. It's not even Gatorade. There's 2 sports drinks that have it in right now, and actually I can't remember the name of them. But if you go to like health food stores or places like that, they'll have them. You already can find them. Bicycling magazine. has advertisements for both of those every month. For those.
The human product is called glycerate.
Glycerate, thanks.
Yeah.
Do you have any input on the purities of water? Like, you know, some areas got alkaline water or acid water and I mean, you have some waters, not the best water around, and you know, I mean.
My only opinion on that is, if you think there's a problem with the water, don't use it. You know, go with good quality water. I mean, I know there's lots of places here where people have to have their water hauled in, or there's arsenic in wells or whatever. So if you're not sure, you know, try to get water that you know is good. It's hard to answer a question like that because the water can have anything in it, you know. And obviously, the pure and better the water is that you're using all the time, the less problem it's likely to cause in your dogs. Okay, I think we move on to Dominique now.
I want to warn the people against using glycerol on the basis of this talk. I think it's all very well for Ali to work with it at Cornell, but glycerol has a very checkered career in clinical use, especially when it's used in more concentrated solutions. Ali gave them 2.5 grams in 100 mils or 25 in a liter, which is about isoclonic. And if you go more than that, you can get some real problems with using glycerol.
That's
So you should be, if you want to fool with this stuff, you should really make sure that you use it pretty dilute. Also, hyperhydration. Now, you showed you one study from Arizona. There's a number of studies with hyperhydration in people now that don't show any advantage with exercise. And certainly there's 3 main studies in horses which show no advantage with excessive water loading. I can tell you how to water load if you want to water load. I was here with a team in 1983 that was 2 minutes ahead in North America after 2 days. And the team was staying with Phil Cole, who had this nice iron silicon water, and the Saturday night the team went next door to the Hughes household and had a nice water softener. What a water softener does is put sodium in instead of in exchange for iron, silica, and other calcium. And when the first dog came down from the truck, and I sort of caught it a bit going down from the truck to sort of ease the strain on its front legs, I said, "What have you done? These damn things were 1.5 to 2 pounds heavier of retained water. Hyperhydrated with sort of water softener water that they weren't used to." A dog and you can control your water balance sort of in 1 or 2 hours if you drink water or drink beer, which you've all experienced. But if you drink extra sodium like that, it takes 3 or 4 days to equilibrate. So hyperhydration makes you heavier, makes you slower. Another example is pseudopregnancy, where the bitch accumulates water. In fact, the studies of human female athletes in the progestational phase where they accumulate water and get hyperhydrated, they don't perform so well. So I don't think you should come to a meeting like this and hear something about glycerol and think you could hop out and sort of try it for yourself or get it from your local friendly drugstore. I think that you should wait till it's in a product so that you can sue them.
If I could just add one thing, I agree that you want to be careful with the concentrations you use it, and at the concentrations that we use it, I believe that it is safe. And I believe that it does have some good applications and would be better than, say, using soda or water load, because it is slightly different. It works in a slightly different way. When the animal starts exercising, that water becomes liberated because the glycerol is becoming metabolized. And you can really titrate the amount of hyperhydration that you're using by the amount of water and glycerol that you use. Now, I agree that the last word hasn't come out of this, and I'm not advocating that everybody go out and try this. What I'm saying is that in clinical cases and in showing some promise also in the human side, and I know that all the cyclists, all the elite cyclists in the Tour de France were using glycerol this year, so it does, at least those guys believe it works, and there's some pretty good evidence that shows that it works. It's a new thing, so there's people on both sides of the fence. It's one of those things that use caution and make up your own mind.
You're done?
Before talking about this exercise-induced oxidative stress in working dog, I'd like to make 2 comments back to the panel we had yesterday. The The first one is that if I'm dressed this way today, it's not because I failed in medicine. It's because I failed in making money out of sled dog medicine, so I had to find a second job to make it. And I started working as a fireman for the Paris Fire Department. And what I'm going to talk about is basically what we did on these dogs, because, and the reason why I want to talk to you about that, it's not because I don't want to talk about sled dogs, it's because for me, any kind of stress is bringing to the same results in any dogs. So that's why search and rescue dogs might be an example of stuff that we could do on sled dogs in the future. The second comment is some kind of general feeling that I have that we bring you a lot of information, lots of funny supplements, and my feeling is that if you have some money, you'd better concentrate your money on the basic diet you're using for your food. Concentrate your money on increasing and improving your training and equipment and etc. And then if you have money left, and only if you have money left, then put that in the supplements and be happy with this. There's no secret mixture, there's no secret stuff that's going to help you if you don't work correctly on the basics for your dogs. So the first step is here. As I always say, it doesn't, people don't like that too much, but if you can't afford to do something correctly, just don't do it, if you see what I mean. So that's just a comment. Now, next slide, please. So, we're going to quit sled dogs and we're going to go to Chile for an expedition that we run with the Paris Fire Department and the search and rescue dogs of that department last April. Next slide. And before explaining you exactly what we did, I'd like to come back on what the goals on a scientific and practical point of view were. Next slide. What we wanted to do is try as much as possible to start to quantify the stress that these dogs are under when they have to work in really tough conditions. When I say start to quantify, it's because this is part of a 5-year program, and this 5-year program should bring us to have these dogs work in hostile environments of different, qualities. We started with altitude. We're going to do it again in altitude next year, and then we'll work them in tropical climate and probably in very cold conditions if we can afford to work on that, maybe in Fairbanks in the next years. So our first step was to try to choose one site that would permit us to have the dog work exactly in the same condition than when there is an earthquake, for example. Our canine unit in Paris is designed for disaster problems, which means that these dogs are working in Paris and around Paris each time we have terrorism, which is quite often in Paris, believe me. Each time there's a building crashed, etc., they have to find people, and they work under real hot stress conditions because this is, the wreckage is really something tough on the dogs. And then, when it comes to earthquakes, we have to travel to the other part of the world and just, we're going to leave Paris in 2 hours and bring these dogs to work where there's a problem. And quite often these problems occur in high altitude, especially in South America. And if you come from sea level to high altitude, let's say over 3,500 meters, that's already a problem. With no acclimatation, then the hypoxic stress the dogs are under and men are under is something you have to add to the work, the stress coming from the work. And it turns to something that we wanted to work on and see if we could prevent the consequences of the stress. So we had to choose one side that would permit us to transfer from the sea level to over 4,000 meters in less than 24 hours, as much as if it was possible. These dogs are search and rescue dogs, so they have to be able to work in some kind of ruins. And if we wanted to compare as much as possible the effects of altitude, of different levels of altitudes, we needed to have the same conditions to work these dogs, which is not easy, which means, in fact, almost the same ruins. We didn't want any snow because there are no sled dogs, and ruins, I told you. And By hazard, we got in touch with some people that who explained us that there was one volcano on north of Chile named Licancabo, which was a volcano for the sacred volcano for the Incas in the past, and he had built some temples all around that volcano. So every, let's say, 1,000 meters, you have the same temple almost, in ruins of course, but almost the same. So we could design some practical tests for the dogs that were almost standard and go to altitude very quick. And that volcano was really was really easy to reach with four-wheel drives. I mean, from sea level, we could reach the base camp at 4,500 meters in something like 16 hours, as far as I remember. So it means that we were in altitude as quick as possible. Next slide. Next one. So, who was in that expedition? Next slide. We had our canine unit from the Paris Fire Department with 5 dogs. We had 5 dogs coming from the Chilean Army, the Carabineros, for those who are familiar with this country. My vet school was involved, the Sorbonne was involved because they wanted to work on the influence of stress on the behavior of the dogs, and they got some quite interesting results. We made, of course, a study on men with some MDs. We had the Royal Canin Research Center involved, and as usual, when you do such things, if you want to find money, you need to find sponsors. If you want to find sponsors, you need medias. If you want medias, you need to bring them with you. So we took some TV people and photo people, and this way we could also have more people involved in the experimental study and get more blood out of these guys. Really be care what happened to them. Next slide. Dogs. So we had 10 dogs from the Chilean and the French army. The Chilean ones were German Shepherds. Same stuff. I mean, the Chilean army has been formed trained by the German army. If you see what I mean. So they're all the same way. The dogs are the same. The people are the same, and there's no discussion. When in France, it's a little bit different. Some of you are interested by our dogs. We brought 2 of them with us. It goes from a large Doberman to a small Pyrenees Shepherd, which is that big, through German and Belgian Shepherds and any kind of crossbreed that we can use. The only thing which is important for us is that the dog is working and motivated to work. That's the only thing. So it's a different concept, right? But it's usual with French people. Next slide. So how did we organize that? Next slide. Well, we left Paris to Santiago. That's something like an 18 hours flight through Buenos Aires. We had the dogs in the cabin of the Air France flight, and we met these guys in Santiago de Chile. We took another plane to fly north of Chile, another 3 hours flight to the port of the harbor of Antofagasta. Then we took some 4-wheel drive vehicles, went up to 2,500, made a first test, went up immediately to 4,500 and made a second test, and stayed there to make some other tests on the slope of that volcano. The base camp was in Bolivia, and as I said, at the University of Fairbanks, that's yesterday, the day before yesterday, or yesterday, I don't even remember. That's really nice when you organize such an expedition, because between Chile and Bolivia in the desert of Atacama, there's absolutely nothing, right? There's no customs, there's no nothing, there's not even a road. And when you arrive there with your expedition, suddenly there's a customs stuff. You have people here waiting for you. You say, what's the problem? Oh, we need the papers for the dogs and blah, 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 blah. But when you're aware of that, you bring a lot of t-shirts and pins and then no problemo, right? Next slide. So, this was our scientific goal. Our practical goal was to refer all the problems we could have with the dogs and see what kind of equipments we would have to bring in the future, etc., etc. That was purely practical and technical. On a scientific point of view, I don't think I'm a scientist myself, but we tried to do as good as we can. We wanted to focus on that oxidative cellular stress. Next slide. What's happening when a dog, a horse, a human, or a rat is is running, is that exercise induces that cellular oxidative stress, which is in fact the generation of some free radicals containing different forms of oxygen. And these free radicals containing these funny forms of oxygen are dangerous because they destroy the membranes of the cells and then they destroy the cells. And it might seem bizarre to you that we're working on an oxidation which is involving oxygen in some hypoxic conditions, because altitude is hypoxic conditions. It doesn't mean there's less oxygen in the air. The concentration of oxygen in the air is always the same, any altitude. But the thing is that you don't have the same quantity of oxygen for in the same volume. In other words, you have the same concentration in altitude, but the volume is much bigger. So each time you breathe less oxygen. That's why it's called hypoxic. And the reason why hypoxia is interesting in that kind of study is because, in fact, what happens when you have a hypoxic condition is that the whole cell doesn't work good anymore, especially all the energetics and all these funny systems that permit to the cell to be stabilized in terms of water inside, outside, the ATP, sodium potassium system. I mean, all this is depending on the energetics of the cell. If there's less oxygen, this is not going to work good. Then the cell gets swallowed if you look at it with a microscope. And the membranes around are more fragile to any kind of problem. And then, what this means, in fact, that if you go to altitude and stay in your bed, nothing's going to happen. Right? You're not going to feel good, but nothing's going to happen on a cellular point of view. But then if you work, which is the goal, then you're going to increase the impact of the cellular oxidative stress. Next slide. So that's what a normal cell membrane looks like. You have proteins, you have lots of fatty acids, and especially unsaturated fatty acids. It's just clean and nice. Next slide. Then when it comes to your stress conditions, these free radicals are going to destroy everything. And destroying especially the fatty acid, the unsaturated essential fatty acids, they're going to produce some products that we can analyze to try to quantify what happened to the membrane. Next slide. This is, for example, what happens. This was done on men, as far as I remember, because I forgot to put the name of the author. Well, as I said, my wife did. She's in charge of that. This is what happened when you exercise men and you look at the production of free radical in muscle and liver, for example. You see that the exercise, any type of exercise, is going to increase the quantity of these damn free radicals. Next slide. This study was also done on humans and refers to some gas that you're going to breathe when your cells are destroyed. The pentones are, gases, basically, coming from the oxidation of the essential fatty acids in the membranes. And if you can catch them when the human or the dog is breathing, then you can quantify what happens in the membrane when it's destroyed. My English is not extremely good this morning. It's probably a little bit tired, but I have to apologize for that. So here is a study that was done on human, and you see that when you don't supplement with vitamin E, which is probably one of the best antioxidants, where you have a very important production of pentones in the exhaled air when the guy is running. But if you supplement for 3 weeks with 200 milligrams vitamin E, then you see that you have an important decrease in that pentone production, which means in fact that you have less problem with the oxidation of the membranes. Slide. So these free radicals, who are they? They are toxic components produced by a lot of reactions involving oxygen in the organism, when the organism is working, but also in some other conditions. So they have funny names because it's just oxygen, just built differently. Next slide. How are they produced? They come from some biochemical reactions in every single cell, and they can be induced by exercise, yes, but also by some UV rays, by some polluants, by some radiations, by smoking. Smoking is a good source of free radicals for the body. Next slide. What happens after they've been produced? Well, they're going to propagate at a really high speed. It's some kind of a chain reaction. When they appear in the membrane, they go to the next cell and produce some more free radicals and peroxidize all the membranes. So finally destroy the cells, because they don't only destroy the membranes, they also destroy afterwards the nucleic acid and all the proteins that are in the cell. So they bring to some cellular disorders which are involved in stamina, and when people or animals are getting old, and some pathological affections like coronary disease, some eye disease, cancers, ischemic conditions. So it's really something that's fundamental for the organism. Next slide. What are they doing? Well, they almost break everything. I'm not going to destroy you. No, I'm not going to destroy you. I'm not going to describe you all that.
5 minutes. Go.
Hey, you guys! Did I time you?
They won't have any morning coffee. So you don't think we should start more?
I would just be the last when you... Fine, okay, thank you. Next slide. Next slide.
Can we go back to that last one?
Yes. Come back to that's good.
No, it's backwards.
No, backwards.
Backwards.
Yeah. No.
It's on reverse right here.
So what? Doesn't work? That doesn't work. I love it. How do you do it? It's your fault.
Yeah, we're going to push the left hand in the button.
Push the what?
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Forward.
One more?
Yeah. But the organism is normally able to defend itself against these free radicals. So you have a lot of things that are in the body, in the cell, and that are normally able to fight these free radicals. The only thing is that when these reactions overwhelm the body's defense, then the problems are going to occur. And what we wanted to do, next slide. Next one. That's fine, we know there's some lesions. Thank you. What we wanted to see is if we could work on the main free radical defense system with nutrition. When you come to the enzymes which are fighting the free radicals, for example, you might think that it's interesting to put them in the food. So you will increase the quantity of SOD, for example, superoxide dismutase, and this SOD is going to fight the free radicals. Well, it doesn't work because enzymes are usually proteins, and when you put that in the stomach, most of them are destroyed, you know. So there's no way, as I said yesterday, there's no way to put your money in such things. It's not going to help at all, I mean, according to me, and I guess according to you guys. No? 2 minutes, I know. So we went to the nutrients, right? And actually what we want to work on is the really antioxidant vitamins that we have available on the market for cheap. One is vitamin E, one is vitamin C, one is beta-carotene, and probably in the future we'll work also on lycopene, which are some kind of funny stuff that you find in vegetables, so it should be not too difficult to find. Next slide. Next one. Next one. So what did we do? We did almost the same study on humans and dogs. So we divided our people and our dogs into several groups. And for dogs, we had to change our protocol because we wanted to basically have all the dogs on the same basic dry food, so that the only parameter that changed would have been the supplementation. The thing is, at the same time, we have the BSE coming from United Kingdom, you know, that marvelous silly cow, or whatever you call it in English, disease. And the Chileans, you know, well, they said if there's some beef in the food coming from France, it's gonna bring us the BSE, blah, 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 bullshit, but that's what they said. So we couldn't import that food to the Chilean dogs so that they're on the same dry food that ours. Happily, we could bring our own food for our dogs, which means that at least we had one group of dogs on that high quality dry food. But we told them that this was only chicken as protein. It's not true, but that's fine. And this French group was supplemented with vitamin E and omega-3 fatty acids. So Dr. Krautfeld is going to say that this is antagonism. And in a way, I would agree. But the thing is, the goal of that study was to see if the omega-3 fatty acids were joining the structure of the membrane and changing the quality of the membrane. So if the omega-3 fatty acids go into the membranes, then they're going to need more vitamin E to be protected, but they don't have any antagonistic effect because they are not used for other reactions. In other words, they're used for structure. They're not used for metabolic reactions. That would be my answer to that discussion we should have had yesterday. Next slide. So what did we do? We listed some parameters that we could work on. I'm going to go directly to the results because they're not going to be happy. Next slide. We also did some study on the behavior. I told you, these guys just video recorded everything they could and then transcripted that on papers and talked to us about some huge behavioral modifications that we didn't see. That's maybe because we don't know dogs. Next one. Next one. Next one. Yeah, so results. Practical results. What kind of pathological problems have we been facing? Well, we've been facing stuff that you know on sled dogs, that we know on sled dogs, pores abrasions, because it was a volcano, so very abrasive soil, 60% of sodium chloride in the ground. We didn't take any booty because I'm stupido. So we had pores abrasion problem, but now we're going to have booties in the equipment. We had some ophthalmia, eye disease, because once again it's altitude and it's always sunny and it's really tough on the dogs, so I didn't expect that either. And then we had stress-related problem, myoglobinuria, which might also be hemoglobinuria because this came after the stress of travel, and sometimes we know that dogs can pee red. They break some red cells, while just walking, and then they're going to pee the results of it. So we didn't have the right equipment to know exactly what was going on. But then we had some stress-related problems like stress diarrhea, dehydration, overheating, etc., etc. This is part of, next slide. This can be considered as part of what's known in humans as acute mountain sickness. This is the acute mountain sickness for humans. It's generally headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. Then it turns to acute pulmonary edema or cerebral edema if the conditions are really bad. For us, in our groups of humans, we went up to the acute pulmonary edema. One of us turned to nuts. So maybe he was starting a cerebral edema, but 2 days after he was okay when he went back to the sea level. So I don't think that was that bad. But for the rest of us, we all went through that kind of problem. Concerning the dogs, we can say that these diarrhea, dehydration, physical fatigue, and the aggressivity we have on the Chilean dogs, because they have different relationships with their dogs than ours. So these dogs try to start a rebellion, against their. Yeah, that's true. Really, they started not to want to obey. Then this can be related to that acute mountain sickness. The other problems are related to the climate conditions. Next slide. Next one. Two things that seems to me really interesting. One is the water requirement of these dogs. And back to what Dr. Reynolds just said, maybe glycerol can be useful for us in the future. This is the quantity of water that was drank by these dogs each day, which is in fact 7 to 8 liters, and referring to their body weight, it means that they multiplied by 5 their water intake during that expedition. And just like this, because we wanted to sea level to 4,500 in 16, 17 hours, if you don't remember. Next slide. Then, another thing that's interesting and can refer to Dr. Cronsfeld's speech probably, but also maybe to some metabolic modification. And this is also to show you that, for me, it's the best demonstration of what using a high quality dry food can bring you, instead of using a lot of supplements that are expensive. The French dogs were receiving a 35-25 dry food. Okay, it's not a commercial food. It's not on the market, so I can advertise for that. High quality means high quality in the raw materials, in the process, and an increased level of proteins and fat, right? And we had to compare that finally to what the Chilean dogs were eating, which was a premium, what I call a standard 30-20 dry food, and what people call premium. Premium doesn't mean anything. I mean, super premium doesn't mean anything, and hyper premium doesn't mean anything. What means something is the results you have on your dogs. So now if you look simply at the quantity of food these dogs have been eating at sea level and at the base camp, they were traveling the same way, they were working the same way, and they were housed almost the same way, except for two of our French dogs that we kept in the tents for some more human reasons, I would say, for us more than for the dogs. At sea level, you see the French dogs, which are a little bit less heavy than the other ones, ate 400 grams per day, referring to 1 kilo of metabolic body weight, which could be a standard unit that's 150 calories. Where the Chilean dogs were already eating 170 calories for the same body unit. At base camp, French dogs went up to 170 calories, where the Chilean dogs went up to 230 calories. These dogs had the same energy requirement, no doubt about that. But it's the way, for me, it's the way the energy of the food is transferred into the organism, which it's changed. So you probably have a component of that coming from digestibility, undoubtedly, and from what David Cronsfeld just explained to you. But I can imagine there's also metabolic utilization of the energy, which has been increased in that case. And as David said, I mean, when you transform chemical energy to mechanical energy in a muscle cell, then you produce some heat. But if you can have the heat production decreased from 75 to 72%, for example, this means that you lose less energy transferred into heat, and that you can gain in the transfer in mechanical energy. That's probably part of the deal. Now we need to understand why. And in fact, the ones which are really important for us are, especially one, is the peroxidation time of red cell membranes. We put the red cells into some peroxidating solution, and look, at the time these red cells were oxidized, which means destroyed. It's easy to do. I mean, you just look at it and take the time, and you have an effect of altitude. In other words, altitude is destroying more cells. But you also have an effect of nutrition with some good statistical tests, which I don't know anything about them, but I have some people to do that for me. They told me that they were able to quantify the two effects. Fine. The nutrition effect means that in the dogs receiving the high quality dry food plus the supplements, we had less peroxidation problems on the membranes. That would be some kind of a rough summary of the whole stuff. Next slide. Concerning the behavior study, that was also interesting. These guys speak a language that I don't understand much. I mean, the people specialized in behavior and sociology and etc. But they define the Chilean couple, man and dog, as being an authority relationship, which means do that, no discussion, boom, right, German way. No, I know, but you're close to them. Well, German Swiss are the same. Oh, yeah. But that's fine, it works.
Go ahead.
Then the French couple was defined by them as democracy, which means it doesn't mean the dogs are doing whatever they want. It means the dogs are working by themselves, and the guy doesn't interfere too much. I mean, he's not and stuff, and well, sometimes it can turn into a mess, which is usual for France. The effect of altitude was that for the Chilean dogs, after a certain time in altitude, rebellion was the main problem. These dogs just didn't want to listen anymore. They didn't want to do what the people wanted them to do, and they went to rebellion, which means that they bite their handler. Where for us, for our dogs, there was no modification. That's the conclusion of the behavior study. Next slide. Okay, let's go. This is to summarize everything, the effects of altitude and nutrition on man and dog, to compare exactly what happened. If you look at work capacity in man is really destroyed by altitude when there's no acclimatation, where in dog it's a little bit slower, but they still work perfectly. Nutrition seems to have a good effect in man, but seems to really have some effect in dogs, definitely. Induced pathological problems, very tough on man, existing and tough also on dogs, but a little bit less. Related to nutrition, the effects were better on dogs. And if we look at cellular lesions, the cellular lesions were more important on dogs than on humans, which is exactly the opposite of what you can expect when you look at the clinical result or the work capacity, for example. But how can we explain that? We can explain that through nutrition and say that the effects we have related to nutrition is not extremely statistically significant in man, but this is mainly due to the fact that when you're working this way on a nutritional protocol, you can have the dog eat whatever you want, where you will never have people eat their damn fields every single day. Never. You will always forget them or throw them away. So that's one problem. And then the second thing is that definitely this shows that suffering is mainly a mental feeling, you know. And when you start having problems in altitude, you yourself, I mean, some of you probably did go to altitude, I mean, you become anxious, and then every single problems become bigger, bigger, bigger. The doctor doesn't have that kind of approach. He's suffering or he's not suffering, that's it. And so that's why probably they keep their work capacity much better than humans do. Next slide. So practical consequences, next slide. We're going to have new equipment, and we won't forget our booties and etc., etc. Of course, now we know exactly what we need to bring in such conditions. Even if it's in a disaster, everything will be ready. Next slide. We approximately can, I mean, for vitamin E, that's sure. For the other ones, we're going to work on that. But this seems to me now to be a minimum. I mean, the optimal, from what we saw, can go up to 500 milligrams per day of vitamin E for 60-pound dogs, and that's a lot of vitamin E. But of course, you have to include in this the vitamin E you have in the food, right? Which is not always the same. So you have to look at what's in the food. And well, from some other studies we're running, actually, it shows that the vitamin C has no effect under 500 milligrams, but I've always been in accordance with what David did publish years ago, saying that the normal quantity of vitamin C that should be in the dog food is 1 milligram per kilocalorie, which is a much higher level. And finally, beta-carotene, the results of what we are running actually in lab, show that to be efficient, you need at least 20 milligrams for a 60-pound dog. But that's other experimentation. Next one. So the future, next one. Future for us, it's a new expedition in February 97. So just next year we'll go to Argentina on the Aconcagua, which is over 7,000 meters. This time we'll use the same basic diets for all the dogs and only work on one supplement per group of dogs, which was a little bit of a problem in the design of our protocol, but we need to adapt to practical conditions. We'll be able to work on the expired pantins, which we just worked on the methodology on that first expedition. Now we're going to be able to quantify that stuff and also to quantify some urine parameters coming from the destruction of the membranes. And then we'll do that in tropical climate. These are, and maybe if we can afford to do it in some very cold climate, because what we learned from working our search and rescue dogs yesterday morning, for example, is really interesting for us. I hope that we can work on that in the future with foals. Next slide. That's it. So behind this, there's lots of people working on that subject. Sport nutrition is one, but you also have people working on free radicals in cancerology and coronary heart disease, geriatrics, etc. This is a common point between all the problems related to oxidative stress in cells. And I think that with this kind of approach, we'll be able to provide some useful information for some other conditions in dogs. In other words, for me, you can work a lot of dogs in labs. You will never reproduce the racing or working conditions. So at that time, you need to be on site and work with the dogs. That's what Rami is doing by racing his own dogs, and probably learning more from races than from treadmill, I would say, even if treadmill is necessary. I have these dogs on treadmill too, but if I really want to know what's happening in them, I have to go into some tough conditions, because nothing can replace the field. That's why we need to go to these studies. Next slide. That's finito, over. I'm late. I know, that's my fault. I apologize.
You want to ask questions of Dominic?
I wanted to ask about the omega-3 fatty acids. You mentioned that as a recommended supplement.
Yeah, right. What we did with good results, because we did analyze the change in the fatty acid composition of the membrane afterwards. The dosage we utilized was 300 milligrams of omega-3 fatty acids, which means 1 gram of fish oil. Fish oil contains most of the time 30% of omega-3. So that's about it.
Could I just comment on that? We had a question yesterday at our panel of a long-distance musher, a very good one, who had red blood cells crash from the 7th to 9th day of a big race. I talked to her later, and it really looked like these red cells broke up. And what Dominique was studying was vitamin E and these omega-3s. And vitamin E tends to keep cell membranes flexible and fluid, so that and elastic. And one of the main things that omega-3 does is the same sort of thing. He mentioned it, membrane fluidity. So these two supplements he was trying here, the vitamin E and the omega-3s, could be very relevant to that kind of situation. I found working with sled dogs that when they've been stressed, it's very difficult to get a blood sample without getting pink plasma, which means the red blood cells are fragile. And I think this work with Dominique is very relevant for all that. Do you have any more questions, or time to go? Thank you once again, Dominique.
Well, very
Are you going to